do and should do. The problem is that when you have a fight not against armies, which is the case of Syria, Egypt, we never spoke about terrorism, Israeli state terrorism against the Egyptians. We spoke about wars between two military sides. This is very difficult in the conditions prevailing in places like Gaza or the West Bank, where you have militias, you have arsenals of weapons, etc., and the army attacks them, and there is collateral damage to civilian population. To me, this is very difficult to define as state terrorism. It is attacking military objectives or sort of military objectives, an army which is not a real army but can cause damage, and you need to fight back and defend your population. And it is very, very unfortunate that civilians are hit. But if Israel targets intentionally civilians, this is a different matter. This can be defined as state terrorism. I don't believe that we have done it normally. The practice is that things happened collaterally.
I'd like to get your response, Professor Finkelstein, and also if you could include in that, you have a chapter in B'yan Chutzpah called Israel's Abu Ghraib.
Well, on the issue of terrorism, I agree with Dr. Ben-Ami's definition. It's the indiscriminate targeting of civilians to achieve political ends. That's a capsule definition, but I think for our purposes it suffices. What does the record show? Let's limit ourselves to just the second intifada from September 28th to the present. The period, for that period, the record shows approximately 3,000 Palestinians have been killed, approximately 900 Israelis have been killed. On the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, I'm now using the figures of B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. On the Palestinian and the Israeli side, roughly 1/2 to 2/3 of the total number were civilians or bystanders. And if you look at the findings of the human rights reports, B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, and so forth, they all say that Israel uses reckless, indiscriminate fire against Palestinians. And B'Tselem says when you have so many civilian casualties, you have 600 Palestinian children who have been killed, which is the total number of Israeli civilians killed, 600 Palestinian children killed. They said when you have so many civilians killed, I don't particularly like the phrase collateral damage. When you have so many civilians killed, B'Tselem says it hardly makes a difference whether you're purposely targeting them or not. The state has responsibility. So you could say Israel, using numbers now, is responsible for 3 times as much terrorism in the occupied territories as Palestinians against Israel. That's the question of terrorism. Let's turn to an ancillary issue, the issue of torture. Now, the estimates are up to 1994 and 1995 that Israel tortured, and I'm using the language of Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, Israel has tortured tens of thousands of Palestinian detainees. Israel was the only country in the world, the only one, which had legalized torture from 1987 to 1999. The record on torture, on house demolitions, and targeted. 1999 is when we came to office. I wish that were. I wish that were the saving grace. But the fact of the matter is, being faithful to the historical record, the record of labor has been much worse on human rights violations than the record of Likud. It's a fact that the only Israeli government during the period from 1967 to the present which temporarily suspended torture was Begin from 1979 to 1981. On the record of house demolitions, Mr. Rabin used to boast that he demolished many more homes than any Likud government. Even on the record of settlements, as Dr. Ben-Ami well knows, the record of Rabin was worse in terms of settlement expansion than the record of Yitzhak Shamir. And, a fact he leaves out in the book, the record of Barak on housing startups in the occupied territories.
Building more houses.
Yeah, was worse than the record of Netanyahu. It's a paradox for, I'm sure, American listeners, but the record on human rights, an abysmal record in general, and in particular, the worst record is the record of labor, not Likud.
Professor Norman Finkelstein, author of Beyond Chutzpah. We move ahead to Shlomo Ben-Ami. In this last part of the debate, I asked the former Israeli foreign minister to discuss Israel's human rights record and the allegations it's tortured tens of thousands of Palestinians.
Tell you the truth, I don't know about the numbers, and we have seen different governments in the British have done it. What the British did in Palestine in the 30s is there is nothing new in what we did that the British didn't do before us, and the Americans now in Iraq and elsewhere. What I find very, very uncomfortable is really is this singling out Israel that lives in a very unique sort of situation in comparison with other countries. But
Norman Finkelstein makes the point Israel's Abu Ghraib, so that you're making reference to what America did in Iraq.
Okay, but if you would come from another planet and examine the resolutions of the UN, the Security Council, you might reach the conclusion that there is only one sinner in this planet, and this is the State of Israel, and not anybody else.
But I'm quoting your own human rights organizations.
Okay, I mean,
B'Tselem is not the United Nations.
It speaks in favor of Israel that we have a human right, we have B'Tselem, and we criticize ourselves, and we want to change things.
I will agree with that, but then you have to say it doesn't speak too much in Israel's favor. That's the only country in the world that legalized torture. It was also the only country in the world that legalized hostage taking. It was also the only country in the world, yes, as your Chief Justice called it, keeping Lebanese as bargaining chips. Israel was the only country in the world that's legalized house demolitions as a form of punishment. Those things have to also be included in the record. In addition to, I totally agree with you, it's to Israel's credit that it has a B'Tselem, an organization for which I have the highest regard and esteem. I agree with that.
Okay, but you see, the thing is that the conditions where Israel has to operate. This is we do not have Sweden and Denmark as neighbors, and we have neighbors that have taken hostages and have taken hostages that forced us to exchange things that were not very popular. Rabin himself gave away 1,500 Palestinian and Lebanese prisoners in exchange for 3 Israeli soldiers, and Sharon gave away 400 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for 4 bodies of Israeli soldiers. So we are living in that kind of place.
But that may tell you that's because they take so many people prisoner that they have a lot to give back. Right now, as we speak, there are 9,000 Palestinian political prisoners in Israel.
We live in the conditions that we live. We are not, as I said, this is not Scandinavia.
Dr. Ben-Ami, you know as well as I do, international law does not apply to some countries and not to others, and some continents and not to others. Either it applies to everybody or it applies to nobody. So to use the excuse, well, in our neighborhood, we don't have to recognize international law is simply a repudiation of international law.
I'm not saying that we do not have to recognize international law. I
well, then
say
if it
that
applies,
the conditions, I mean, there are conditions where you cannot apply these lofty principles, which are very important, but you cannot apply them.
You know,
and the British is
an interesting example.
Well, it's an interesting example.
They did a comparison.
They did it in Gibraltar, with Margaret Thatcher. They did it in the Falklands. They did anywhere.
Did an interesting comparison. It compared the British policies of torture in Northern Ireland with Israeli policies of torture. And in the 1970s, there were thousands of terrorist attacks by the IRA. And B'Tselem's comparison showed that the Israeli record is much worse than the British on the question of torture. That's the facts.
Yeah.